Welcome back to the Student Hub Live. This session is about evidence-informed practice. We're going to unpick this whole issue, and I'm delighted to be joined by Eric and by Alison and Hyan, who have all been contributing to a book that is in publication. And we're going to talk about this really, really interesting thing that we've sort of touched on a little bit today, about why we need research to inform practice, and also why we need practice to then inform research. So this whole really interesting cycle we've got going on. And you guys have approached it writing chapters each, I guess, in this book from really, really different perspectives. Alison, you're the lead for teaching and learning, so here at the Open University, and you've got a variety of different roles. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself to our students at home?
Yeah, sure. So I was originally a teacher. I was a science teacher in secondary and then further education. And then I got the bug and I did a master's myself and then was doing sort of some contract research, some teaching. And I've ended up supporting teachers through developing their own research in various areas of exploring evidence-based practice and evidence-informed practice, which we're talking about today.
Brilliant. And Samantha's saying the title of this sounds a bit scary, which it can do initially. And will it be a benefit to E103 students who are just starting their learning journey as well?
Yeah, I mean, the concept itself, so, yeah, it's got these words, which we're here today to try and unpack what is evidence and what does it mean. But actually, it's all about learning. Yeah. So we're talking about how we find out new things, how we find out what other people have found out, and what we can find out ourselves from our own studies. And
it's so interesting to interview people who are like research active, who are doing things, because often at the start of a learning journey, you think, why am I learning this method? Why do I have to write something about ethics? Or why do I have to do these things? And when you start doing research and building it in, you then appreciate some of the stuff you've been doing right at the beginning of your learning journey and see why, although it might have looked a bit maybe unlinked to other stuff, all those methods and different ideas are really important. Hyan, could I ask you to introduce yourself as well, because you've joined us as a guest from the University of Leicester, so welcome.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. So I'm currently working as an associate tutor at the School of Education of Leicester University. So I currently work on two distant learning programs, MS in educational leadership and as well as MA in international education. So in this role, I support professional researchers, who are working in kind of like a really diversity of culture and educational context and to carry out small-scale research in their own professional context. And before that, I worked as an English language teacher in a school in Beijing, China, and I was also a subject lead in the local district area. So in that job, I worked with teachers quite a lot, and so there was a lot of teacher kind of like inquiry and also the idea of like teachers working together to kind of like develop practice and as well as how to use research evidence to inform our practice as well.
And it's so interesting to hear a bit about your journey and stuff, because our students at home are thinking, they're at the start of their learning journey, maybe changing careers, unclear about maybe what the future might hold. And isn't it interesting how you sort of built around those things to where you are now? And I guess things change as well in the future. Yeah. Eric, can you tell us a bit about you?
Yes. I'm currently one of the academics working on the postgrad in education program area in the university. And my area is mainly around educational leadership and management. So I come in with a slightly different view on education, on evidence-informed practice, but actually looking at the work of middle leaders and head teachers and how they're able to draw on evidence, the broad range of evidence available to them to inform their leadership and management practice. And in a way, in doing so, also support teachers and newly qualified teachers who probably just graduated and starting their teaching journey as well within an educational setting. So I'm very, very excited about issues around how you draw on the variety or range of evidence available to inform middle leadership or even senior leadership practice.
Okay, brilliant. So that's a lovely introduction to you, and we're going to sort of find out a bit more about you. But like all sort of starting places for the OU, it's really good to look at our definitions and terms. And I wonder, Alison, if you can give me sort of a clear idea about what evidence-informed practice is, and also just thinking about that word informed as opposed to things like evidence-based. What the difference is this something you can sort of briefly tell us about, please?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting because they just sound like words that are very similar, don't they?
Yeah.
But and we were reflecting because we've written this book together that's in a book series called about evidence-based practice, and it's been growing for a few years, and the terminology and the political language around that terminology has changed, and we were just reflecting on that, and we need to reflect that in the book series because the book we've just written is about collaborative teacher inquiry. So let's go back to the definition. So evidence-based practice became very, very popular in the sort of national UK language of this is what all practice should be based on, evidence, which sounds like it's sort of nonsensical.
So
sort of like,
can you give us any examples of that? Because I think that the words are just so powerful, and often something, especially as new students, we don't think about. We just write them, and maybe don't think about the implications of them. Can you give us an example?
Well, that was the problem, really. It sounded so obvious that you would base your practice on evidence, but then it was what sort of evidence, what counts as evidence. Now, what's happened is that phrase of evidence-based practice has come to mean one thing, that the gold standard evidence that the government would like our practitioners to use, and this has come from the medical tradition, is large-scale trials, randomised controlled trials, big studies which generate lots and lots of numbers about if you try this, will it work? And if it works, then all teachers should be using it. And what works has been, the subject of quite a few books. And that's what teachers are being fed. This is what you should be doing. But there's been not a sort of backlash, but a debate about that. That's not the only evidence. Yeah. And it's not always the only evidence that can help really complex situations around learning and in schools and in settings. How do you value other evidence? And so people have asked, us to all move towards informing our practice and not basing it on a fact that this is knowledge and this is what you should do and this is the best practice, but actually gathering knowledge that you can find out about your own context, but from other people who've studied in similar contexts, to sort of think about what's relevant for you, the people in front of you, the people you're working with and the children you're working with, the setting you're working with. And that means that people have to be much more critical and informed about all of the sorts of evidence that you could draw on. And I know that's what we're going to be talking about.
It's so interesting because I think, you're right in terms of this, I guess, hierarchy or standard of things. And these randomised controlled trials were better evidence than what my mate down the street said, And there are, as we know, these different methods and different ways of collecting information about the world. And I guess that's what the core of what you're saying. So what you're saying really is that some of the stuff has shifted and you're trying to get other sources of information out there. But equally, you've mentioned things like funding. I guess there are implications in terms of outcomes and policy and stuff like that. All those things are really important. So you can see why a trial with drugs can have an outcome that you can think, yeah, that's fine, you can have that money for that. But other things are really tricky, but they're so meaningful because if you get people behaving badly, all sorts of things can happen.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that will hopefully help to unpack, because, the history of evidence-based practice, mainly coming into education, has been drawn from clinical practice. So you'll see that in clinical practice, it's very easy. There is a question is posed, an answerable question is posed, and within that you try to gather evidence to kind of try and answer that question, which is answerable. And then through that generation of evidence, you look at ways in which that evidence can apply to your practice. So you start testing for truth, you start testing for validity, and that is a kind of clearly laid down process in terms of how you do that. But with regards to evidence-informed practice, we're not just looking at that. We want you to we're looking at drawing on a wide range of evidence to be able to inform your practice. But you have to make a judgment in terms of what evidence you're looking at, what evidence is most suitable for the decisions that you're making. Because at the end of the day, the key thing for a practitioner, for a teacher, for a medical leader, is to be able to make an informed judgment based on the evidence that is available to them. So the evidence may not necessarily be based on the current practice that you're actually even engaging in, but practice of others. That's where the community of practice issues come in terms of, can I draw on evidence that a colleague has also sort of investigated, and to what extent does that apply to my practice, or to what extent does that help me make an informed judgment in terms of what I'm doing? So if a colleague, for instance, has done a small-scale investigation into student behavior in their classroom, for instance, if you are in a similar context, is that evidence really valuable? Is it something that you're looking at, or the contrary? A research study probably may be about a similar situation carried out in a completely different context to your teaching environment. And you're asking yourself, well, will that apply to my context? So these are questions that we'll expect practitioners to ask. And that is what we were arguing, that it's an extension of evidence-based practice. You're not just looking at all these RCTs that has been pushed, but you're looking at a variety, a range of evidence, and basing your judgments clearly in terms of how that can apply to your practice on an everyday basis.
Yeah, because you mentioned a really important word there that I like to emphasise, which is that context, isn't it? Yeah. Saying that, you know, what somebody might find in one situation may not apply to another part of the world or even another time because of the cohort of people. And all of those things are fundamentals of like research design, aren't they? Yeah. That whole idea about asking the right questions.
Yeah. Yeah, so talking about evidence, from my personal experience working with classroom teachers, I felt that often the most powerful kind of evidence is the kind of that they actually see with their own eyes, that they actually collect through their own inquiry in the classroom setting or with their colleagues. And we see this a lot in the lesson study project that we did in London, 3 London boroughs, Camden, Redbridge and Croydon. So in the lesson study projects, the teachers have the opportunity to design lesson together, and then they teach and observe each other. While they observe during the lesson, they would look at individual pupils, and then they collect evidence about what they're learning, what they're not learning, what are the misconceptions that the pupils have, and then they collect these evidence during the lesson, and then after lesson they sometimes interview the pupils as well, asking them directly about what have you learned in this lesson, you know, what aspects of teaching do you feel that have helped you learn, or what aspects do you feel like, you know, haven't been perhaps so helpful. So teachers collect all this evidence, and then the next step they meet again and then bring all this evidence to reflect on the practice, the previous practice, and thinking, okay, so what do we need to change or adapt in our next lesson? How can we make the learning more kind of suitable for the needs of our group of children here? So this kind of evidence that they collect themselves, I feel like really have that, powerful propelling for action, so that they can use it and then immediately kind of develop change based on it.
Is there something there about, like, we were talking about this sort of, I guess, hierarchy of evidence in terms of the scientific approach having more credibility than other areas, and you encouraging that shift. But just thinking about, I guess, this idea of teacher inquiry and about validating people in the practice to be able to get that knowledge and say, this is how it's working. You can research your setting in itself, and empowering those people to find and reconsider, I guess, what is working.
Can I give an example of that? Because I was involved with a group of schools, and they were part of one of these randomised control trials, and they were really excited because they got the funding. So they had data collected across the nation about this intervention that would help reading. They went through the study as one of the experiment schools, and the findings were, this is a it doesn't make a big difference. The data doesn't improve the children at the scale of the nation. So this isn't one that we'd recommend you go forward with at a national scale. But because the teachers had been involved, as Hyan was saying, in some qualitative research about their own practice, we had somebody involved with an undergraduate study, somebody involved with a master's study, and some just practitioner inquiries. And they didn't agree with these results because they'd found this particular intervention was so powerful with particular groups of children and their parents. And so they found it with English as additional language students and their parents. It made a massive difference to the way that they worked with each other. And so that evidence was so valuable to them. They then used that intervention, even though nationally the result was. But, at a national scale, there is a place for those results. But then you have to discuss and debate within yourselves in your context as to how you're going to use that.
It shows how important the question you're asking is, isn't it?
And again, back to the issue of context and the so what. The context and so what is very important. And context, we're not just looking at physical location, but in terms of context, you want to look at issues around scale, you want to look at issues around applicability within your own context as well. So for me, you're right. Key things to look out for in terms of your evaluation of evidence is mainly around other things that we'll probably maybe talk about, but the key things are context. And then you ask yourself as a practitioner, so what? I mean, yes, although the RCT outcomes are saying, well, there's no significant change in behaviors. But if you've got qualitative evidence that says, yeah, but within this small group of students that I'm dealing with, there is powerful qualitative evidence or there is powerful narrative accounts that suggest that, you know what, with this intervention, it helps with small gains. Then as a practitioner, you should be asking yourself, well, then this evidence is valuable for my practice.
Yeah. And I like your use of the so what, Eric, because I think that's something you can never start doing too early, is thinking, so what, when I read this piece of information, how does that apply? And you're doing it here in this context also.
And I feel that teaching inquiry is particularly, relevant and important at the current moment, because the UK is also undergoing quite a substantial curriculum reform at the moment as well, in different subject areas. I know that in mathematics, for instance, there is really this emphasis on kind of, deeper, more kind of conceptual understanding of mathematical concepts, terms, and principles. So there's also kind of like emphasis on skills like problem solving and real life math. So these are all kind of newer territories that I feel like teachers can really play a very, very crucial role in advancing practice and understanding of it as well.
Now you're working with some teachers, Hyan, and basically how are they getting this information, and then how can other people get this information about what's working?
Well, I felt that teachers, these days, they're kind of becoming more and more interested in evidence and also in kind of the broader kind of picture of how things are, not just what's happening in my classroom, but also interested in what's happening elsewhere in other schools or, across the council, nationally or even internationally, what's happening. So teachers are, I think they're more and more interested in kind of getting evidence about, good practice elsewhere. From my experience, of course, we know that a lot of the, unfortunately, research and literature that's currently not so accessible to classroom teachers at the moment. But there are kind of like open resources that teachers can access. I know that, for instance, the teachers use Google Scholar to search for things, even though you can't get everything, but you still can get something from it. And then teachers are very good at using social media to access research. So things like LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, the constant circulation of, what's kind of currently in debate and kind of really hot and relevant issues. And another good example is ResearchGate, to talk about using it to access, actually, it's a great source of accessing information. You can get so much from it these days, isn't it? Sometimes you can have look at people's full list of publications, and then even you can get in touch with them and say, can you send me a copy of that, please? And then blogs, so blogs of academics, professionals, as well as some organizations like BERA. They all have kind of very up-to-date.
You're right.
So this kind of...
Teachers are drawing, and practitioners in education practitioners in general are drawing on a variety of evidence. And as Hyan says, yes, it's well recognized that some of the what we'll call academic publications are sometimes kind of hidden from practitioners, unless you're probably maybe working in a university or subscribing to a professional organization that gives you access to these journals, because most of them are housed in journals, and these journals require subscription of some sort. So either it's an individual subscription, which means that the teacher or practitioner has to pay for their own subscription, or through a course they are attending at a university, or through a professional body. But there is growing debate and push to try and make as many publications or as many scholarly work open access as possible. So that there's a growth area. There are lots of open access journals coming on board these days. I mean, the rigor of the publications, I think, again, comes down to professional judgment in terms of the quality of the outputs that are coming through there. But we're seeing that movement come on board, that yes, academics are gradually making their work much more accessible. I mean, the Open University's oral site is
Yeah.
a typical example.
Yeah.
So before the last publication that I had with Addison, for instance, went out, we had to make part of it accessible to kind of people who go to that free website. And we're seeing universities repositories also replicating that. So a range of publications are available through freely available university repositories. But yes, social media is another outlet. So we're having teach meets on Twitter where we're getting people share practice of what's actually happening in their classrooms. As Hyan said, teachers value that quite a lot, because if you're hearing from another practitioner, this is what I've done and it worked, it gives people the opportunity to say, hold on a minute, okay, if it worked, will it work in mine?
Yeah.
And then they pose questions to their peers.
Yeah.
To
But
try
we
and
should
find
be careful
more.
to say, to pick up your point about the quality of it, because actually, and I was just at a conference a couple of weeks ago, the European conference, where they were trying to talk about the rigour of what's out there and start to challenge it, because what you've got when you become a university student is this fantastic digital repository. You've almost got the opposite problem. It's like, where and how do I search this international repository? And it's all peer reviewed, which means that the people have been checking it for the quality of the different resources. And so that are available, and the evidence that's available to you. And it's been really sort of sense checked about all the things that you were talking about sort of the quality of it before you read it. But you need to be in a university to be able to have access, and the librarians are fantastic at helping you. I was just talking to somebody the other day, and they said they had a literature problem in the middle of the night, and there was a 24-hour chat. Perhaps the librarians might not want to sort of advertise that overly,
no,
but
they do. They're always going on about it.
but the Facebook site has live events, because there is so much out there, and this library, once you come here, you can access that literature, and then you can offer that to the practitioners that you work with. You can offer your reading of it, and you can make real-time benefits from, and even articulating it once you've read something and made sense of it, to articulate it to your colleagues and people that you work with, or people who are interested in things like you, is part of what you can do through your studies and make a real difference to somebody else's practice. If you've been excited by somebody, you excite somebody else in their setting, off you all go and make a difference to the practice.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, and it's brilliant. We've got a session with the library a little bit later where they'll be going on about their 24-hour web chat and the range of services. But it is a fantastic thing, and how information has changed, even from a few years ago, with it being more freely available, in particular as OU students. But it's very important, I think, for those level 1 students to sort of recognise that while you've got this opportunity there, everything's in the module material right now, and it's great to have it, but you don't need to worry too much about
People have done
all
the
of that.
filtering for you to find really the best articles for you to get your teeth into and
Now,
to
you're
think
mentioning
about.
words like best, you've mentioned words like rigour, and this whole idea about being critical and peer-reviewed and having some sort of credibility behind what is published is really, really important to academics, but it's also important to students when they're reading stuff. How might students sort of approach things critically?
Very, very interesting question, Karen. And we've written a badged open course on this that helps students through the process. But the key, what I always recommend is a kind of a 5-step process, really, to kind of take your time to get your teeth into any publication that you're going through. So first, probably maybe want to interrogate what we call the worldview, because there are people that probably maybe position themselves as kind of scientific researchers, so value a particular type of evidence. So in terms of their research design, they are looking at it from a particular worldview. It may contradict your own worldview in terms of how if you see things. You may be somebody who values both narrative accounts as well as what we call the numbers issue. So it's something that you need to be aware of as an academic or as a student wanting to get yourself into understanding how to review any paper. So you try and unpack that whilst you're reading to see whether there are any underlying assumptions in terms of how the research itself is being designed. And then you want to look at the research question, because remember, at the end of the day, it's that so what question. So you look at the research question. Is this something that is relevant to the assignment I'm writing? Is this relevant to the small scale study I'm trying to embark on? Is this relevant to actually gaining more knowledge about my own practice? If it isn't, then you know that probably maybe it's the paper you're reading is not relevant. And then you want to look at the research design, because then you begin to understand, oh, okay, so in terms of answering this question, the study has been designed in this way because that's what's going to generate the evidence to be able to answer the question. So you look at the research design and ask yourself questions. Okay, oh, that's interesting that they've probably maybe combined some interviews with probably focus groups, or they've actually probably maybe done a large-scale survey because they want to reach a huge number of population. And so you begin to ask yourself those questions, and that's another way you need to look at. And then you look at the discussion. So then, okay, so if they've posed this question, they've gathered all this evidence, what is it telling them? What's it telling the researcher, and what's it telling me as a reader? So you go through that, go through the discussion, and if you begin to see that, oh, okay, this makes sense, this applies to my setting, the next question is you ask yourself, so what? If this applies to your setting, how can I use this evidence in my assignment, or how can I use this evidence to influence my own practice? So this is kind of a simple 5-step process that students can actually deploy in terms of critically evaluating any published work that they're engaging with.
And is it the same for practitioners then, that process?
Absolutely. I was just thinking that we must point people towards the session that Jill Clifton did last year, which I understand that you've re-shown this year, because what she did was it's so topical, even more topical this year, because she was looking at plastic bottles and how an environmental sort of issue they were, and she was gathering different types of study, just like the ones that Eric was talking about. You know, some big scientific studies that were telling you this about this bottle, and then some political study. You know, all different sort of perspectives, and it's what questions you want to ask to help you with your decision making about those bottles. You know, I sort of was left at the end thinking, oh, now what do I do with those bottles, you know? But because there's all these different kinds of evidence, and it's the same for practitioners. I think we've talked quite a lot about how practitioners use it, but I think the fact that you're on an Open University course means that you have a chance to research what you value. And you ask, it's about back to the questions. You can set the questions that excite you and interest you, and there'll be new questions arising from what you've read. And I think I've got this with me because, and Hyan sort of alluded to it, but the British Educational Research Association really wanted to put this back into the sort of public forum and say that close to practice research is about the questions that are important to people who do the practice, who do the jobs, and so we need to be helping people to critically read what's out there, but actually also be able to apply the same principles to the way they carry out their own studies. And all of our courses are absolutely fantastic at supporting people in developing as researchers.
Now, people can do that, but only at a certain level, and you're involved in the postgraduate programme. So it's probably worth mentioning that students who are doing a master's qualification with us at the Open University will get to do something like this in their dissertation, but those undergraduate students who are at the beginning will have a lot of those questions, but they'll be needing to do specific things as part of their learning journey. So at a master's level then, once they've done all their undergraduate studies and they're doing their dissertation, what sorts of things should they be bearing in mind about getting evidence to inform their practice and vice versa?
Again, usually they'll be engaged in a small-scale study of some sort, and we'll work through some research questions. And as Alison said, it has to be something that is meaningful to your practice. And once you settle on that, you then begin to look at ways in which you can design the study to gather the evidence to answer those questions. But the key thing is to begin to construct questions that are relevant to your practice, because at the end of the day, we want students, we want the knowledge that is gained to inform from their practice. So the key thing is, don't just pick up any question. We want questions that are relevant to your practice. And through that process, you'll be able to gather evidence to either answer the question or to some extent even gain more knowledge in terms of how you can change a particular aspect of your practice.
Also, I would recommend that try to align to picking up on your point, Eric. Try to, when professional researchers picking their focus, I think it's a good idea to kind of align their focus with their school development priorities. What are the schools are kind of what are the main issues that the school that they're working with are trying to kind of like tackle at the moment. For instance, it might be pupil premium, or it might be how to get girls to be interested in math at a really early age. So all these kind of issues, when these kind of focus are aligned that way, then it's more likely to get the school leadership on board, to get their colleagues on board, to participate in the research, but also to find a way to, once the research is done, to actually, apply their findings to change practice in a classroom setting.
Yeah, and I remember David Hargreaves had said you should be developing research that pulls people in. They want to know your findings rather than just doing a project that's useful for your studies and then pushing it out there and saying, hope you find this useful.
Yeah.
And I think I would argue that a lot of the people on the undergraduate modules will find themselves perhaps not going in and carrying out an interview, but they are researching because they're researching all the evidence that we've talked about. So if they go and do a sort of review of some literature and they review this paper and that paper and the other and they bring it together, they're answering, you're able to answer questions that mean something to you. And I think many of our courses are asking you to respond to that. What does this mean to you? And you discuss that on the forum, you find all these different perspectives and have a debate about it. And that can inform what you believe, what you value, what you think, and what you do next. And it doesn't have to be you go into somewhere and actually go and collect the data, because it's all out there. Other people have done that, and we can learn so much from that.
You agree, and at undergrad level, it's likely, at least in year 1, year 2, they'll be dealing a lot with secondary data. So yes, we've kind of referred to research as if it's just gathering empirical data, but yes, in its broad sense, everything that we're saying would apply to appraising, even critical appraising literature. Yeah.
Now, we've spoken a lot about what works and what's good, which is one side of the question, and I'd like to focus on sometimes learnings from things that maybe don't work. I mean, Hyan, you've done this lesson study project where you've interviewed people and you've sort of looked at things that haven't worked as well, both from the teacher perspective and also the student's perspective. So I guess flipping the corner, what can we learn from things that aren't working, and how can that then lead to better ways of working?
Yeah, I would say that to learn about things that don't work are probably equally as important as to kind of learn about things that work. So that's why I think teaching inquiries are so important, because a lot of times I think from academic research, they tend to report things that really work, and best practice or golden standards. This kind of research is about putting out there what they think works. But then through teaching inquiry, they have an opportunity to test things and to find out, actually, for me, in my context, what doesn't work. And then from those experiences, you can develop, really kind of useful, evidence and practice that you can share with others, so that other people don't, either make the same mistakes again, or kind of go through the same kind of path again. So that can save other people time and can be very illuminating as well. Yeah.
That's why if you align your study, as you said earlier on, if you align your study, if you're working in a school context, if you align your study to some of the key issues that your school is facing, that becomes a very, very powerful. So if it's student attendance, if it's pupil premium, if it's something that the school is already dealing with, I mean, the outcomes of your study is very important. Whether what you're doing is working or what you're doing is not working, still provides a lot of evidence on which decisions can be made.
So it's similar to the idea about what is the problem, and then what is the question I'm actually researching, and then what can we do about that?
And it often sort of raises new questions. I was just having a discussion with somebody this morning, because I had a colleague who did a doctorate about class size, and actually concluded after 4 years of deep sort of study that class size, the question they were asking, it didn't make a difference. And it's sort of, okay, do I fail my doctorate? But actually, they realised that they weren't asking the right question, because it wasn't about the size of the class. It was all these other sort of variables. It was actually the teaching that was and then, they've spent the whole of the rest of their career sort of investigating what it is and how, because obviously that's quite a political statement to say class size isn't important, because schools could just go and pile on bigger and bigger sort of classes onto teachers. But so are people asking the right questions, and that teaching quality is the most important thing. So you change the questions. So it is, the answers depend on the questions. If you ask good questions that are productive, but you can also ask questions that take you down a road and make you challenge, things that we're often researching things that we think anecdotally, it'd be common sense. And so you think you might have done that study thinking, I'm going to prove that class size is really important, so that politically everybody will be in a small school. But that wasn't the finding, and actually it's come back to the quality of teaching being so important.
That is very common at master's and doctoral level, that through the research process there is an opportunity for people to refine their questions and redefine the questions. I mean, at the early stage of any research investigation, it's likely that soul searching happens for you to see whether actually the question I'm posing is exactly answerable or it'll take me on the right path. Yeah.
So can we end by thinking about the contributions you've each made in this book then, and what your sort of key way of adding to the pool of knowledge about teaching for inquiring teachers is? What have you written about, Eric?
Yeah, my bit is mainly around the key I'll start with trying to unpack the difference between evidence-based practice and the extension that evidence-informed practice provides. And I look at the different levels of evidence that are available to a practitioner. So we'll look at evidence that I call at the micro level. So the everyday evidence that the teacher inquiry or even inquiry from peers, which is available to the school and to the teacher. And then there are these different, the meso level of evidence, which is publications that are not necessarily about your school or about your classroom, but it's mainly about probably maybe a regional study that has been done, probably maybe in Buckinghamshire or in Northamptonshire, that is kind of relevant to your study because the context may be similar, the challenges may be similar, and then we've got the sort of the macro level evidence, which is mainly around high-level research and scholarship that's mainly deposited in journals, and trying to get people to understand the differences in all these types of evidence and how to draw that into your practice. And then later on in that session, we look at the different types of evidence that teachers actually drawing on, and there's an interesting case study in there that unpacks from the teacher's perspective the range of evidence that actually in practice colleagues are drawing on in their practice.
Excellent. What have you written about?
My chapter focuses on lesson study, which is a particular form of, how teacher can go about as a group to carry out, classroom inquiry. So I kind of in the chapter I sort of talked about the international context of lesson study and how it developed. It's developed in the UK, and I talked about the procedures, how to carry out lesson study, and also talked a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings that kind of make lesson study a powerful tool, not just for developing learning, but also for developing practice. Then the chapter sort of ends with some practical recommendations about how to carry lesson study as a small group or at a school level or at a network level. And there are some elements about talk as well, because talk is the sort of like a main tool you use, if you like, in a collaborative context. So what kind of what are the kind of characteristics for talks that enable more productive collaboration as well as kind of for generating learning outcomes?
Oh, thank you. It's a real challenge to summarise a whole chapter in a few sentences. But Alison, would you like to have a go at telling us what you've written about?
Well, I've put the book together, so I'm sort of, I've got the group of authors together. You can see I've got people with sort of real experience that can give some real insights, and case studies really powerful through the book. And we've also got a chapter about professional learning communities and how two schools went about it in completely different ways. One mandating it and really making sure everybody did it, and one asking for volunteers. And so I guess my job around the book and the various chapters was to give the history of the language of how we've moved from this evidence-based to this evidence-informed practice way of thinking, and encouraging to acknowledge the value of teachers working together, learning together and researching together. So talking about the language of networking, collaboration, communities, and then it's a practitioner book. So at the end, sort of crafting the takeaways that from all of the chapters as to what you can actually do about this in different settings.
Brilliant. Well, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Alison, Hyan and Eric. That's been a really, really interesting discussion about things that hopefully our undergraduate students won't have to worry about for too much longer, but it's so useful to be able to see how so much of the stuff they're learning is going to be feeding into things, and the important relationship between evidence and also practice as well. So thank you. HJ and Sarah, how's everyone at home?
Well, it's been mostly students that are further on in their studies that have been commenting, and one of the comments is about, right at the beginning, when you think about stuff like this, it's very, very scary. It's very, very scary. But now I'm just about to start my level 3s. I can tell you, it's not scary, and it's. While you're going through it, you're walked through it. It's almost like you're handheld so that you know what you're doing, so that when you're looking at when you actually start looking a little bit further, you know what you're going to be doing. So you taught how to do this and what things to look at. So that's been really useful. And I know how much this doesn't scare me now, because I looked at my EMA and it's all to do with research. And I'm like, oh, I can do that now. If I'd seen that at level 1, I would have panicked. So all of this stuff has been really, really useful. So yeah, it's fantastic.
But like we were talking about earlier about referencing and
Yes.
you know how we can worry about it very early on, but you don't necessarily need to worry about it now. It gets easier.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
And I think as well, it's been a useful session in thinking about how we're using our learning as well,
Yes.
because we talked earlier in one of our sessions about how we have placements with what we're doing, and it's all about putting our learning into practice and how we use that. And we also talked about how the evidence we use may be suitable for different contexts. So, for example, some piece of evidence may be useful in a city school but may not be applicable in a rural school where the context is different. So we've had a really good conversation about this.
Really good conversations going on.
Brilliant. Oh, well, thank you both very much, and thank you for an excellent discussion. Right, we're going to show you some more of our campus tours from around the university, and then our next session is going to focus on early childhood. So I'll see you very soon for that.